Good morning. We'll give everybody a chance to get in their spots. I will call the joint meeting of Senate Finance and Assembly Ways and Means to order. Will the committee secretary please call the roll?
Assemblywoman Anderson. Assemblywoman Backus. Assemblywoman Brown May. Assemblywoman Dickman. Assemblywoman Gorlow. Assemblyman Hafen. Assemblywoman Howdegee. I thought she was here. Assemblywoman Kasama. Assemblyman Miller. Assemblyman O'Neill. Assemblywoman Peters. Assemblyman Watts. Assemblyman Yeager. Senator Canizaro. Senator Goycochea. Senator Harris. Senator Neal. Senator Wynn. Senator Severs-Gansert. Senator Titus. Assemblywoman Monroe Marino. Chair Dondero Loop.
Here, and please mark those not here as present as they arrived. We had some members who stepped out to present a bill, and would you please mark Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno absent, excused. Thank you very much. We have a full schedule today, and first we have two agencies up for budget closings, the Lieutenant Governor and the Controller. Welcome to our joint full meeting, and then we will have a work session on the COVID-19 relief programs budget. And we'll begin with budget closing for the Lieutenant Governor's office, which consists of two budgets. And Mr. Leiser, please go ahead when you're ready. And for the audience, a copy of the closing packet is available on the exhibits today. And for those watching online, the online packet is in the Nellis. And Mr. Leiser, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committees. My name is Brody Leiser with the Fiscal Analysis Division of the Legislative Council Bureau. As the fiscal analysts had discussed the closing and work session process on March 27th, today is the first day that the committees will begin actually closing budgets. So as the chair indicated, the closing material is posted on Nellis. And as we shift to the closing process from the budget hearing process, just to give you a little bit of a preview of what to expect today, staff will walk through the closing document, and after presenting each decision point, in other words, major closing issues, other closing items, we will ask the committee for an actionable decision for which a motion, second, and a vote will be taken. And there may be several decision points within each budget. So first up are the two budgets under the Lieutenant Governor's office. The first budget is the Office of Small Business Advocacy and begins on page 3 of your closing packet. The Office of Small Business Advocacy was created by Assembly Bill 184 of the 81st session and codified in Nevada Revised Statutes 224.100 through 224.250. The office, pursuant to statutes, required to receive, review, and attempt to resolve complaints from small businesses, compile and analyze data on such complaints, assist small businesses to understand their rights and responsibilities, provide certain information regarding small business, the public, governmental agencies, and the legislature, analyze, monitor, and make recommendations concerning laws, regulations, and policies relating to small businesses, and disseminate certain information to small businesses concerning the availability of the office to assist them when any concerns arise. There's one major closing issue in this budget, and that major closing issue is the elimination of funding for the Office of Small Business Advocacy. The governor's budget recommends the elimination of all funding and expenditures within this budget, which includes the elimination of 2 filled positions. Assembly Bill 184, as I indicated, had established the office, created the office, and did so temporarily. Assembly Bill 184 expires by limitation on June 30th, 2023. And so the governor's recommended budget is in alignment with the provisions of the statute and the expiration date. There's some information on page 4 about how the office has been funded in the current biennium, which was through federal coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, coronavirus relief funds, and through the American Rescue Plan Act, coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. There is some information there in the middle of page 4 about the reporting that was required pursuant to NRS 224.230 on the office implementation over the interim and its activities, including resource fairs that were held, listening sessions with small business owners and business organizations. The office implemented a customer relationship management system, and also had developed some virtual training programs. While statutorily set to expire and there not being any funding in the governor's recommended budget, during the budget hearing, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor had expressed support in continuing the operation of the Office of Small Business Advocacy. Senate Bill 24, which was heard in the Senate Committee on Government Affairs on February 15th, would eliminate the expiration date of the office, as well as eliminate the current statutory restriction that prevents the use of general funds for support of the office. The Lieutenant Governor's Office and the Office of Small Business Advocacy have indicated that if the office becomes permanent, future plans would be to host legal clinics for entrepreneurs in coordination with local law firms, develop a website, continue its listening and roundtable sessions with small businesses and partners, and estimates that if the office were to continue, total funding need of $604,345 over the 23-25 biennium would be needed. On page 5 of your closing packet, there's a table that demonstrates what that funding would be used for. The funding would support the costs for 3 positions: a deputy director, a director, and an administrative secretary. In follow-up to response from the budget hearing and questions from the committee, the office the Office of Small Business Advocacy did emphasize its unique role in that it serves as a resource and advocate within the government to provide one-on-one assistance in response to complaints, questions, and requests for assistance from small business owners. The office provides a direct line of contact and personalized support for Nevada's entrepreneurs to resolve issues relating to licensing, regulation, and inspection. If continued, in addition to the items I noted earlier, the office had indicated that they would continue to focus on underserved communities in Nevada's rural areas, aiming to assist at least 1,500 business owners in the first fiscal year of the upcoming biennium. Would continue to work with local governments and agencies that oversee licensing and regulation, continue work on improving the small business climate in the state, and continue to work with stakeholders to help build capacity in serving Nevada's entrepreneurs. So, Madam Chair, on the bottom of page 5, the decision for the committees is: do the committees wish to eliminate funding and related expenditures for the Office of Small Business Advocacy for the 23 to 25 biennium as recommended by the governor, or do the committees wish to continue funding for ongoing support of the office in the 23 to 25 biennium with additional general fund appropriations totaling $604,345 over the 23 to 25 biennium, contingent upon passage and approval of Senate Bill 24 or other enabling legislation?
Thank you very much. And I believe Assemblyman Yeager has a comment.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I will say I really kind of struggled with this item. I understand why the governor recommended that the office be eliminated, because that was required by the statute that we passed in 2021. But I don't think I'm ready to pull the plug just yet on this office, and so I want to give it a chance to see what it might be able to do in the next couple of years. When the office was first created, we were basically in the midst of COVID, so I don't know that the office has had a chance to really stand itself up. I would say, obviously, that depends on Senate Bill 24 being enacted, and that obviously is over in the Senate, but I think my preference would be to probably move the sunset another 2 years, to give the office a couple of years, come back, those of us who are lucky enough to come back next session, make a determination of what should happen with that office. And then in the context of that, of course, the governor has a bill for general sort of reorganization, modernization of government. I don't know how this is all going to fit into that, but so I suppose my motion would be to continue funding for the ongoing support of the office in the next biennium and authorize that through the general fund of $604,345, of course, contingent upon the passage and approval of Senate Bill 24 or other enabling legislation.
Second from Senator Canizero. Did you have comments? I'm sorry. Senator Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question is, we still have 1 point, I think it's $1.2 million in ARPA. Can we still allow ARPA to cover and then general fund pick up?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Neal. The answer is yes. I mean, coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds could continue to be used. As the committee members are aware, we're going to have a work session later today on the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. And as you indicated, Senator Neal, based on fiscal staff's calculations, there currently is approximately $1 million in unobligated funds when everything that has been approved to date is considered and everything that has been identified within the governor's recommended budget is considered. There is approximately $1 million of unobligated funds. There will be additional savings realized with those funds, and ultimately there will be a decision point or consideration for this body to determine how it wishes to prioritize the use of those funds. And so I probably gave a longer answer than I should have, and I'm thinking of my colleagues that tell me to keep it short. The answer to your question is yes.
Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the suggestion by Senator Neal, because we haven't spent all, I mean, it's only $1 million, and I know that's considered budget dust, which is not a lot of money to this body, but that is money that we know we can use for this office because we're currently using it for this office. We also know we have allocated pretty much all the ARPA dollars, but we also know not all of them have been spent. And this is a nice way, I think, to be able to use those dollars, because we will expect some dollars to come back to us, and then we're going to have to reappropriate them. So I'm very supportive of Senator Neal's suggestion. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, if I could, I would be happy to rescind the prior motion that I made and make a new motion. So I would rescind formally the motion I made to keep the office and use general funds to fund it.
Okay, then I need the second to rescind as well. And rescinded, and I need.
No vote needed.
Okay, Assemblyman Yeager, would you please restate your motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the suggestion from my Senate colleagues way down the aisle there. I think it's an appropriate suggestion. So my motion would be to continue funding for the ongoing support of this office for the 23 to 25 biennium using ARPA funds to the extent available. If the ARPA funds are sufficient to cover the entire cost, we can do that. If we need to supplement with any general funds above and beyond, would ask for authorization to do that for a total of $604,345 over the biennium, contingent upon the passage and approval of Senate Bill 24 or other enabling legislation.
And do I have a second? Second? Second by Senator Canizaro. Now, any further discussion? Senator Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will support this motion. I have gone on record with our previous Lieutenant Governor that I was vehemently opposed to this office. I felt that it was just wrong that the state needed to have somebody guide folks through the burdensome regulations that we have. But I've been assured by our Lieutenant Governor, our current Lieutenant Governor, that one of the things that they will do is look at some of these regulations that they can eliminate, since their office has had so many Nevada businesses and citizens reach out to them trying to get some of these regulations understood. So I will be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional comments? Okay.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, please.
if I may, Brody Leiser, LCB Fiscal. While I believe the intent of the motion is clear, I just want to make it crystal clear that by ARPA funds, we are talking about coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds.
Assemblyman Yeager.
I concur.
Okay, now, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next budget within the closing packet begins on page 7, and this is the Lieutenant Governor's budget account 1020. There's one major closing issue in this budget, and that is the recommendation for a new unclassified executive assistant position. Governor recommends general fund appropriations of $174,669 over the 2023-25 biennium to fund one new unclassified executive assistant. The office indicates that the position is needed due to an increase in its administrative workload related to the office taking on additional responsibilities, including work associated with the Advisory Board on Outdoor Recreation, the Keep Nevada Working Task Force, and the Office of Small Business Advocacy. Currently, administrative workload is being spread across all existing staff, particularly the existing administrative secretary, but that the new position would take some of the administrative burden off of other staff, such as the Lieutenant Governor, Chief of Staff, Legislative and Policy Director, and the Communications Director. The new position would also allow the office to have administrative support in both its southern and northern Nevada offices. During the hearing, the Lieutenant Governor's office did make a request. Currently, as built in the budget, the new position has a start date of October 1st, and the office has requested that the start date be accelerated to July 1st. And if the start date were accelerated to July 1st, that would increase costs for the decision unit by approximately $22,000 in fiscal year 2024. During the budget hearing, the office had testified the reason for the acceleration is that the intent would be to allow the existing administrative secretary incumbent to move into the new executive assistant position. If that were done, then the administrative secretary position, once it was filled after a recruitment, would be located in the Carson City office. The incumbent that was referenced currently works out of the Las Vegas office, and the intent would be to allow that individual to stay in the Las Vegas office. And again, this would allow for administrative support in both the northern and southern offices. So the decision point on page 8 of your closing packet, do the committees wish to approve the addition of a new unclassified executive assistant position funded with general fund appropriations of $174,669 over the 2023 to 25 biennium? And if approved, do the committees also wish to accelerate the position's start date to July 1st, 2023 as requested by the Lieutenant Governor's office, thereby increasing general fund appropriations by $22,056 in fiscal year '24?
Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I would move to approve the addition of a new unclassified executive assistant position funded with general fund appropriations of $174,669 over the 2023-25 biennium.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second? Second from Senator Cannizzaro. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With that, I would move to accelerate the position start date to July 1st, 2023, as requested by the Lieutenant Governor's office, thereby increasing general fund appropriations by $22,056 in fiscal year 2024.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second? Second, Senator Cannizzaro. Do I have any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. And next, we'll move on to the controllers.
Madam Chair.
Oops. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Brody Leiser for the record. Before we move on to the next budget, want to cover the other closing items, which begin on page 8 for the Lieutenant Governor's office budget. And typically with these, just to, again, sort of set the stage for what you can expect as we've transitioned to the closing process, staff will not go over these other closing items in detail. We will if there is an adjustment or a technical adjustment, which is a term you're going to hear about 6,000 times over the next 6 weeks. We will cover what those technical adjustments are and ask for authority to make those adjustments as noted in the document. So for this budget, under other closing item 5, I do have a technical adjustment to note that's under the decision unit E225. We've worked with the Lieutenant Governor's office and are recommending technical adjustments to reduce the recommendation by $26,324 over the 23-25 biennium for costs that were already accounted for in the base budget. And then additionally on page 9, other closing item 6, there's just a minor technical adjustment with the E670 decision unit to remove the salary adjustment that was included in the governor's recommended budget. And the net impact from that adjustment is $0 because there was a offsetting adjustment in the base budget as a result of making that correction. So there is no dollar impact from that. So fiscal staff would recommend other closing items 1 through 4 be closed as recommended by the governor. Other closing item 5 be closed with the noted technical adjustment to account for costs already included in the base budget. Other closing item 6 be closed with the technical adjustment to remove the salary adjustment for the lieutenant governor and request authority for staff to make other technical adjustments as necessary.
Thank you very much. Senator Cannizzaro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would move that we do allow for the technical adjustments as just indicated by Mr. Leiser.
Thank you very much. Second? Second from Assemblywoman Backus. Any discussion?
And Madam Chair, if I can clarify my motion.
Yes,
and all
please.
other items. So any other technical adjustments that may need to be made, and then the ones that were just indicated by Mr. Leiser.
Thank you very much. Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes. And now, Mr. Leiser, I am so sorry. The next item on our agenda is the Controller's Office, which also consists of 2 budgets. I'll invite Ms. Day to the table to walk the committee through the closing packet. And again, the closing packet is available on the exhibits table and online on Nellis. Ms. Day, please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Stephanie Day, Fiscal Analysis Division. On page 11 of your closing packet is the Controller's Office budget, budget account 1130. This budget was heard by the committees on February 10th. There is one major closing issue in this budget, which is the request for a new Accountant Technician 2 position. The governor recommends general fund appropriations of $155,383 and a transfer from the debt recovery account revenue of $404 over the 23-25 biennium to fund a new Accountant Technician 2 position, grade 32, and associated costs for the debt collection section. There is a companion decision unit that is included in the next budget that will be presented. The agency indicates that the position is needed to more timely process and return funds collected on behalf of its state agencies. The debt collection section currently has 1 Accountant Technician 2 position distributing debt recovery funds to agencies, boards, and commissions. For the past 4 fiscal years, all funds have not been distributed to agencies by the end of each fiscal year due to the high volume of transactions. The debt collection section is located in Carson City and currently has 4 staff members, and according to the agency, the addition of this position would allow the debt collection section to enhance its collection efforts, resulting in an anticipated increase in average debt collections by a minimum of 25%. The debt collection section recovered over $1.6 million in fiscal year 2022 and estimates that the anticipated debt to be collected would increase to $2 million annually with the addition of the position. The decision point for the committees on page 12 of your closing packet. Do the committees wish to approve general fund appropriations of $155,383 and transfer from debt recovery account revenue of $404 over the 2023-25 biennium to fund a new Accountant Technician 2 position for the debt collection section?
Thank you very much. And do I have a motion? Senator Cannizzaro?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me a moment to clarify. I would move that we accept the decision units as just indicated by staff.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second? A second from Assemblywoman Bacchus. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Ms. Day.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Continuing on page 12 of your closing packet, the Controller's Office budget account also includes coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. The table on page 12, the governor recommends fiscal year 2024 funds of $803,766 and funding in fiscal year 2025 of $813,814 to continue funding 4 state and 4 contracted positions. Additionally, coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds of $695,764 in fiscal year 2026 and $350,889 in fiscal year 2027 are projected by the agency to continue funding for the positions. There is a work session scheduled for today to discuss considerations for the budgeting of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, including whether the money committees wish to account for projected 2025-27 biennium expenditures within the legislatively approved budget. The decision point for the committees on the top of page 13 of your closing packet. Do the committees wish to approve coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds of $803,766 in fiscal year 2024 and $813,814 in fiscal year 2025 to support 4 state positions and 4 contract positions as recommended by the governor? Fiscal staff would request authority to make technical adjustments as necessary, including any adjustments to the budgeting of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds that would result from direction provided by the committees during the work session and/or closing of the COVID-19 relief program's budget.
Thank you very much. Do I have a motion? Assemblywoman Bacchus.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I would move to approve the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds of $803,766 in fiscal year 2024 and $813,814 in fiscal year 2025 to support 4 state positions and 4 contract positions as recommended by the governor, and also to have fiscal staff have authority to make technical adjustments as necessary, as stated by Ms. Day.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second? Second by Senator Gansert. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, motion passes. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Day.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are no other closing items in this budget. So moving on to your page 15 of your closing packet, the Controller's Office Debt Recovery Account, which is budget account 1140, begins on that page. Fiscal staff is responsible for developing closing recommendations for this budget. The committees have not previously reviewed this budget. Money within the debt recovery account may only be used to support the debt collection efforts of the state controller. There are no major closing issues in this budget. Or coronavirus state recovery funds. There is one other closing item that is a companion decision unit to the decision that you made in the previous budget. Therefore, staff recommends this budget be closed as recommended by the governor and consistent with the committee's closing actions on budget account 1130 Controller's Office, and requests authority for staff to make technical adjustments as necessary. And that decision was the addition of the position.
Thank you very much. Do I have a motion? Assemblywoman Bacchus.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Chair. I would move to have this budget closed as recommended by the governor, consistent with the committee's closing actions on budget 1130, and also move to have the staff make any technical adjustments as necessary.
Thank you very much. Do I have a second? Second by Senator Cannizzaro. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, say nay. Motion passes. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, with that, the next item on our agenda is a work session on the COVID-19 relief programs budget. As a reminder to committee members, the goal of the budget work session is to provide fiscal staff with direction and preparation for budget closings, which will take place over the next 5 to 6 weeks. I'll invite Mr. Leiser back up to the table, and when you're ready, Mr. Leiser, please go ahead.
I had to bring my coffee for this one. So,
We totally understand.
for the record, Brody Leiser, LCB Fiscal. I'm here to present the work session on the COVID-19 relief programs budget. There's been substantial discussion around American Rescue Plan Act funding this session, and specifically around the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, which we will talk about today. Given the magnitude of the dollars, the number of programs approved to date, and the number of budgets for which funding has been allocated, we are here to present a global picture of the allocations, spending to date, projected and budgeted expenditures, and an update on unobligated amounts and identified savings to date. There also will be discussion on options for the money committees to consider as we've transitioned into the budget closing phase of the 2023 session. Some of the discussion points today may help direct the information to be presented throughout individual agency budget closings with regards to ARPA coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. This budget had a hearing on March 20th, and members have two documents, or should have two documents, including a narrative work session document, as well as Exhibit A, which is on legal-sized paper, and is a table that I will go over here in a couple minutes. While the narrative document is only distributed to members, the Exhibit A table has been posted online and is available for anyone that is watching or listening that would like to follow along or see the attachment. I'm going to just cover some very high-level stuff that's on pages 1 and 2 of the narrative document, and then I'm going to actually walk through the table itself with the members to hopefully help explain what it is that you are all looking at. Just as a reminder, back in June of 2021, the state received $2.739 billion of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. The general allowable uses for those funds are identified there on page 1, including responding to the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, responding to workers performing essential work during the pandemic by providing premium pay, providing government services to the extent that the pandemic caused a reduction in revenue, and making necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. I think, as you all are aware and has been come up in many budget hearings, the deadline to obligate these funds is December 31st, 2024. The deadline to expend the funds is December 31st, 2026. To date, through actions taken by the 2021 legislature, as well as actions taken during the interim, $2.729 billion of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds has been authorized for expenditure. Of that amount, $440.4 million was expended in fiscal year 2022. And accounting for those actual fiscal year 2022 expenditures, as well as approximately $25.5 million in savings that was realized with the closure of fiscal year 2022, there currently is $2.263 billion authorized in fiscal year 2023. And you'll hear me refer to this number several times during the work session today, but want to give you all an idea that the vast majority of these funds have been obligated and authorized either through actions taken last legislative session or through the interim. There are a substantial number of programs that have already been approved that will have expenditures carry forward into the 2023 to 25 biennium, as well as the 2025 to 27 biennium. So I mentioned the $440 million that was expended in fiscal year 22. There also, as of March 28th, there was approximately $112 million expended fiscal year to date. So combined $552.2 million, or about 20% of the state's total allocation, has been spent as of March 28th. And in this document, and as in my testimony today, when I say spent to date or reflect expenditures to date, that would reflect information based on the state's accounting system for which funds have been expended or transferred out of budget account 1327, where these funds are housed. That may be less than actual expenditures to date for agencies or organizations that are currently awaiting reimbursements from the governor's finance office. And we'll talk about the reimbursement policy later on in this document. So with that introduction, I would like to walk the committee members through Attachment A. Hopefully this looks somewhat familiar. I understand it's about 14 pages, and I promise I won't go line item by line item, but we wanted to provide a big picture overall view for the money committees to show what has been approved to date, what was spent in fiscal year 22, what's authorized or currently allocated in fiscal year 23, and what the spending plan is in fiscal years 24, 25, and the 25 to 27 biennium. Those projected expenditures are based on information that's coming from two sources. One, the executive budget as submitted by the governor, or two, supplemental information that's been provided by the governor's finance office that identifies a projected expenditure plan by fiscal year for those programs that we know will take more than, that will go beyond fiscal year 2023. So if you look at page 1 of Attachment A, what should be familiar to you is the description along the left side of Table A. That information is pulled directly from the statement that you all have seen at every IFC meeting, and provides a description for what the program allocation was for, and pretty much will mirror the language that was or is included on that IFC statement. Moving left to right in column A shows the approved allocation, or the total amount that was authorized for each individual program. Column B identifies the actual fiscal year 22 expenditures. Column C represents the fiscal year 23 allocation. Column D represents the estimated or budgeted expenditures in fiscal year 24. Column E is the same for fiscal year 25. And column F is amounts that are projected or that may be expended in the 25 to 27 biennium. Column G is simply the approved allocation, or column A, less the sum of all the other columns. This may demonstrate savings in some instances. This may demonstrate additional funds that are recommended beyond the initial allocation or approval in other instances. So taking, for example, the very first line item, this was approval during the 2021 legislature to restore positions that were otherwise going to be held vacant due to budget reductions. Those positions were restored with coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. Line 1 is specific to state agencies other than NSHE. NSHE also did have positions restored, just to be clear. That's on line 3. But line 1, just walking through line 1, the total approved allocation was approximately $19.7 million. Actual expenditures were about $9.4 million. And you can see in column G that resulted in a $10.3 million worth of savings. That savings has been accounted for. That savings has been obligated or recommended to be obligated, and we'll get to that later on in the discussion today, demonstrating what the remaining amount that currently is unobligated. As you'll notice, there is some color coding on the table, so I just briefly want to go through the color coding. The gray shading simply means there's not going to be expenditures in those years. So taking that first line item again as an example, that allocation was for fiscal year 22 only, that particular amount. And so there will not be expenditures in 23, 24, 25, the future biennium. So those have been grayed out. There are some cells that are colored in green and colored in blue. Both the green and the blue cells are reflective of amounts that are inclusive in the governor's recommended budget. The Revenue Transfer Authority, Expenditure Authority, and/or a reserve set aside is included in the executive budget. The difference between the green and the blue is that the green items are the recommended revenue authority exceeds the amount of the approved program allocation. And those will be addressed in the individual budgets and budget closings when the agencies are presented either to the budget closings are presented to the subcommittee and or the full committee. And I'll walk through two examples just to explain what I'm trying to say and is hopefully clear. On line 5, there was $54 million approved for the replacement of the unemployment compensation system for Dieter. In fiscal year 23, it was estimated that there's approximately $20.5 million to be expended. And then within the governor's recommended budget, there's revenue transfer authority of $32.6 million in 24 and another $32.6 million in 25. If you add those three figures up, you are going to exceed the $54 million that's been approved for this project. So recommendations will be made to correct those during the budget closing, again, in the individual budget accounts. But those are the scenarios that the green cells represent. And I think there's only 8 of them on the sheet. The blue column, or the blue cells, are, in taking row 7 as an example, there was $200 million approved for the Department of Education for grants for learning loss as a result of the pandemic. None of that money has been expended to date. None of it at this point was projected to be expended in fiscal year 23. And so you'll see that the governor's recommended budget, as indicated by the blue coloring, includes $100 million in each fiscal year of the upcoming biennium to expend those remaining funds. You'll also notice what I would maybe call a peach color coloring, line 14, again, just staying on page 1 to walk through the example. What the peach coloring represents is that we've got supporting documentation that indicates there are planned expenditures for the upcoming biennium for this program. However, those planned expenditures are not reflected and not accounted for in the governor's recommended budget as submitted. And that will be one of the discussion points today, whether the money committees wish to account for this type of scenario in the legislatively approved budget. So for that particular example on line 14, this was $4 million approved for the Dean's Future Scholars Program. And there was approximately $1.6 million is estimated to be expended in fiscal year 23, and $1.6 million in 24, and $800,000 in fiscal year 25. Again, the fiscal year 24, fiscal year 25 projected amounts are not currently reflected in the governor's recommended budget. That is the general format of this table, going all the way down through page 12, plus 1 would be 13, through lines 208 are items that have been approved to date. And again, those were actions taken last legislative session or through the interim. Lines 209 through 217 reflect new program or new funding allocations that are reflected in enhancement decision units in the governor's recommended budget. So with that, One thing I failed to mention, and I apologize, but I'm going to go back and just talk about this now. Within the blue cells that are on this sheet, there's about $26 million that's included in the base budget, in the governor's recommended budget, to account for programs which were approved during the interim that were identified for programs that were going to have multi-year commitments, but for which the funding approved in the interim was for fiscal year 23 only. So the work program that came before IFC identified a program, identified that that program would be needed through, say, fiscal year 25, but the funding at the time was only approved for fiscal year 23. So the governor's base budget carries forward funding to continue those programs, and the amount under that scenario is about $26.1 million. And that'll come up later on as we walk through and talk about what the remaining unobligated funds are, because those are accounted for in the budget. So committee members have expressed concerns with the delays in the implementation of programs that were approved by the 21 legislature, as well as during the interim, and expressed concerns about demonstrating an obligation of funds to meet the December 31st, 2024 deadline, as well as wanting to ensure that little to no funds are returned to the federal government because they were not spent in a timely manner, which in part is the reason for the work session today. And so on page 2, going back to your narrative document, on page 2, we've identified 4 areas for discussion during the work session. It includes whether to account for 100% of projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds for approved program allocations over the upcoming biennium, the 2023 to 25 biennium. Whether to account for future 25 to 27 biennium projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds within the legislatively approved budget for the 2023 to 25 biennium. The third item is whether to establish a budget policy regarding the timing of the transfers of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds from the COVID-19 relief program's budget to state agency budgets and or non-state organizations that is different from the current reimbursement policy. And the last item will just be, I shouldn't say that. The fourth item will be information on unobligated funding and projected savings from approved program allocations and determining priorities for consideration of possible reallocations of those savings to address legislative priorities. The last item that I will cover will be a request for authority for staff to make technical adjustments to budgets based upon direction provided by the money committees. Madam Chair, if it's all right with you, I will walk through the entire narrative work session document, or if you prefer, I could stop after each item for discussion. Whatever your direction is, I'm happy to accommodate.
Thank you very much. I think walk through all of them, and then we will go back and allow for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Brody Leiser. The first item for discussion begins on page 3 of your document. And again, this is whether to account for 100% of projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds for approved program allocations over the 2023 to 25 biennium. In total, the executive budget includes, as staff calculates, $1.133 billion of budgeted authority for coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. I said as staff calculates because remember those green cells that we talked about on the table. We know that there's some duplication of funds that need to be removed from the budget. Those are not savings. Those are just, we need to align the authority. And when we account for those, it leaves about $1.133 billion of budgeted revenue authority and expenditures over the upcoming biennium in the executive budget. As I previously had identified, in fiscal year 2023, there is about $2.263 billion in authority. We know that numerous approved programs will have expenditures over a multi-year period, and we know that 100% of those projected expenditures is not accounted for in the governor's recommended budget for the 23-25 biennium. You know, in other words, if you take the $2.263 billion that's currently authorized, you look at the $1.133 billion that's in the governor's recommended budget, it's very unlikely that the state's going to spend over $1 billion in the next 3 months or have savings realized in an amount of over $1 billion over the next 3 months. As I indicated earlier, fiscal year to date, as of March 28th, based on information in the state's accounting system, there is approximately $111.7 million expended of the $2.263 billion of authority in the current fiscal year. Pursuant to the State Budget Act and specifically NRS 353.220, subsection 8B, agencies do have authority to balance forward unexpended funds from one fiscal year to the next fiscal year, as long as the funds are balanced forward and used for the same exact purpose in which they were initially approved. So while not everything that is projected for the upcoming biennium is reflected in the governor's recommended budget, that does not mean that state agencies would not have the authority to expend those funds in the upcoming biennium because of that statutory provision that allows for such balance forward. However, given the time frame for when the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds must be obligated and expended, the money committees may wish to consider accounting for 100% of the projected expenditures over the 23 to 25 biennium in the legislatively approved budget in order to ensure state agencies have a clear expenditure plan for the next 2 years. As well, doing so would demonstrate an obligation of funds by the December 31st, 2024 deadline, and it would also memorialize legislative priorities for expenditure of these funds. As I went over the table, if you recall the peach-colored rows, totaling those rows up, there's about $18.6 million in projected expenditures that is not currently accounted for in the governor's recommended budget. If you look to page 4 of your narrative document, in addition to those items, there are a number of program allocations approved in the current fiscal year that don't have any projected expenditures over the upcoming biennium in the supporting material received from the governor's finance office. However, these projects are likely to have expenditures over the 23 to 25 biennium. So there's a table there on page 4 to give some of these examples. And, you know, I won't go through each of these examples, but what this table represents are program allocations. For example, if you look about the fourth one down at the August 17th, 2022 IFC meeting, the IFC approved $151 million to support construction of new facilities and renovations of existing facilities to expand the capacity and infrastructure of Nevada's public health system. As of March 29th, none of that has been spent. It is very unlikely that it's not going to be spent by the end of fiscal year 23. So this particular item that we're talking about is, would the committees like to provide direction to account for the projected expenditures for these types of projects in the upcoming biennium and reflect those in the legislatively approved budget? And that's what this table represents, is examples that fall under that scenario where it's very unlikely that all of this money is going to be spent by June 30th, And we don't currently have a projected expenditure plan for the upcoming biennium, but we certainly can work with agency staff and the governor's finance office to figure out what that plan should look like. So at the top of page 5, if the committees do wish to account for 100% of the projected expenditures of the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds over the 23 to 25 biennium, they may wish to do the following: direct fiscal staff to work with the governor's finance office and state agencies so that adjustments can be recommended to account for 100% of anticipated expenditures of the funds in the legislatively approved budget for the upcoming biennium. These recommendations can be made during agency budget closings before the subcommittees and full committees, as well as when the COVID-19 relief program budget is closed. Grant fiscal staff blanket authority to make technical adjustments across all budgets in which coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds have been authorized and in which there are projected expenditures in the 23 to 25 biennium in order to reconcile the budgeting of the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. And third, direct staff to provide the committees with a summary and reconciliation of all approved authorizations of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, as well as any necessary adjustments to account for the projected expenditures over the upcoming biennium. That last bullet, in essence, would be something in this format similar to Attachment A, where we would outline the overall expenditure plan by fiscal year and use that format document to bring back to this committee to demonstrate what the overall picture looks like. So the first decision point in the middle of page 5 is basically just what I talked about, but I'll go ahead and read through it so it's clear for the record. And that's one, whether to account for 100% of projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds for approved program allocations over the 2023 to 25 biennium, or not authorize any adjustments for projected expenditures which are not currently in the governor's recommended budget for fiscal years 24 and fiscal years 25. Therefore, allowing state agencies and the governor's finance office to balance forward any remaining authority at the close of fiscal year 23 from the original authorization that's not accounted for in the legislatively approved budget for the 2023 to 25 biennium under NRS 353.220 subsection 8B, and for which the funding authority that is balanced forward must be for the same purpose as the original authorization. The second item begins on page 5, just very similar to the discussion that we just had. This has to do with whether to account for future 25-27 biennium projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds within the legislatively approved budget for the 2023 to 25 biennium. Based on information provided by the governor's finance office, as well as reflected in column F of attachment A, there's about $232 million in projected expenditures over the 2025 to 27 biennium. These amounts are not currently reflected in the governor's recommended budget. And once again, any remaining authority in fiscal year 23 from the original authorization that's not accounted for in the legislatively approved budget would be allowed to be balanced forward to fiscal year 2024 and in subsequent fiscal years for the same intended purpose pursuant to NRS 353.220 subsection 8B. However, the money committees may wish to consider accounting for all future biennium projected expenditures for these programs within the legislatively approved budget to demonstrate an obligation of the funds by the December 31st, 2024 deadline, and to memorialize legislative priorities for expenditure of these funds. There's some information on page 6 of your document regarding discussions around meeting the obligation deadline of December 31st, 2024. The Governor's Office of Finance had testified during the budget hearing that the budgeting of positions and program expenditures with the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds would be sufficient to demonstrate an obligation of funds, and also that the notices of allocations issued by the Governor's Finance Office would serve as further confirmation of constituting an obligation by the federal deadline. While consideration could be given to accounting for planned future biennium or the 2025-27 biennium expenditures in the legislatively approved budget for the 2023 to 25 biennium, committee members have questioned and raised concerns about one legislative body obligating a future legislative body. Staff would just note that one legislature cannot, by ordinary legislation, bind or control in any manner a subsequent legislature, and that the legislature is free to enact any law that is not prohibited by the U.S. Constitution or Nevada Constitution. Therefore, if this body were to account for the future biennium expenditures within the legislatively approved budget, it would not bind the 2025 legislature from approving those allocations. However, I would just note that the 2025 legislature will not commence until after the December 31st, 2024 deadline to obligate funds, and any such action by the 2025 legislature could be limited to a de-obligation of funding for programs unless there are changes at the federal level in the rules and/or deadlines. The bottom of page 6 are again some considerations very similar to the ones that I covered under the first item, and these have to do with if the committees wish to account for 100% of the projected 2025 to 27 biennium expenditures. It may wish to direct fiscal staff to work with the Governor's Finance Office and state agencies so that adjustments can be recommended to account for 100% of those anticipated expenditures in the legislatively approved budget. Again, these recommendations can be made during agency budget closings before the subcommittees and full committees, as well as when the COVID-19 relief program budget is closed. Again, grant fiscal staff blanket authority to make technical adjustments across all budgets in which the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds have been authorized and for which there are projected expenditures in the 2025 to 27 biennium. And again, direct staff to provide the committees with a summary and reconciliation of all approved authorizations of the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, as well as any necessary adjustments to account for the projected 2025 to 27 biennium expenditures within the legislatively approved budget. If direction is given to account for the future biennium expenditures, consideration would be given, and this would be part of what was brought back at closing of those individual budgets and/or the follow-up reconciliation that would be provided to the committees. But consideration could be given to placing those future biennium projected expenditures into a dedicated reserve category within the individual budgets. And then there would be action required in the 2025 legislature to move the authority from reserves to an expenditure category, or through the work program process, the authority could be moved when we get a couple years down the road. So there's a decision box very similar to the first decision box. This one is on page 7, and that is whether to account for 100% of projected 2025 to 27 biennium expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds within the legislatively approved budget for the 2023 to 25 biennium, or not authorize any adjustments for projected 2025 to 27 biennium expenditures which are not currently in the governor's recommended budget, therefore allowing state agencies and the governor's finance office to balance forward any remaining authority at the close of fiscal year 23 from the original authorization that is not accounted for in the legislatively approved budget for the 2023-25 biennium under NRS 353.220 subsection 8B, and for which the funding authority that is balanced forward must be for the same purpose as the original authorization. Madam Chair, members of the committee, that brings us to the third consideration, which is halfway through page 7, starts halfway through page 7. That's whether to establish a budget policy regarding the timing of transfers of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds from the COVID-19 relief program budget to state agency budgets and/or non-state organizations that is different than the current reimbursement process. Committee members have expressed concerns with ensuring that these funds are expended by the December 31st, 2026 federal deadline, and that little to no funding is reverted back to the federal government following that deadline. The committees have expressed concerns with the current reimbursement process to release funds to state agencies and nonprofits, and have indicated that they have received communication from agencies and organizations that they're not receiving timely reimbursements, and that some agencies are reluctant to move forward with program implementation with a sense of uncertainty as to when these funds may actually be available. I would note, again, just to remind the committee, there were a number of buckets or tranches of funding approved in the American Rescue Plan Act. What we are talking about here today is limited to the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. And again, just to recap and discuss about what has been spent to date, which I think is where some of the concerns from committee members has come about getting money out the door. Again, in fiscal year 2022, $440.4 million was expended. I would note that of that amount, $332.4 million of that 440 was to repay the advances received by the Unemployment Compensation Fund. Excluding the repayment of the Unemployment Compensation Fund, that $108 million was expended in fiscal year 22. Or about 3.9% of the state's total allocation. As previously identified in fiscal year 23, there's about $2.263 billion of authority, and as of March 28th, $111.7 million has been expended. Combining both fiscal years, $552.2 million, or 20.2% of the state's total allocation has been spent as of March 28th, 2023. On page 8 of your document, we talk about the existing policy, the existing reimbursement policy of the Governor's Finance Office. Agencies will typically incur expenditures prior to the receipt of reimbursements, and the policy is to transfer funds to agencies and organizations on a reimbursement basis upon request and receipt of supporting documentation, a review to ensure that the actual expenditures are compliant with federal requirements, requires timely processing of the reimbursements, which is dependent upon agencies and organizations submitting complete and accurate supporting documentation, and having sufficient resources within the Governor's Finance Office to receive, review, and approve the requests to process the transfer and payment transactions. During the March 20th, 2023 budget hearing, the Governor's Finance Office testified that the reimbursement process is a federal standard, was defined in federal requirements, however, that advances were allowed under certain situations. They further testified that the reimbursement process allows for a thoroughness in vetting the appropriateness of the expenditures to ensure that the costs are allowable and to prevent any potential federal clawback or payback at the expense of the state. While the projects are vetted prior to approving the initial authorization, the Governor's Finance Office clarified that there's an additional need or additional vetting needed on the actual expenditures to ensure that they are appropriate and in alignment with the program as approved. Following the hearing, the Governor's Finance Office confirmed that the U.S. Treasury does not limit advances of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. However, advances would make it difficult to ensure compliance with the federal rules, and that current staff does not have the capacity to issue advances and monitor compliance on advances as a standard practice. In response to questions as to how many requests for reimbursements have been denied for inappropriate use, the Governor's Finance Office indicated that 3 requests for reimbursement have been denied for not being compliant with federal regulations. We did not receive nor ask for the specific reasons for the denial, but the dollar amount associated with those denials indicated that approximately $18,600 was denied up front, and that there was about $50,400 pending payback or return to the state. On page 9 of your document, there's some excerpts from the Treasury's final rule confirming and emphasizing that the state is allowed and authorized to advance funds up front. Recipients may transfer funds to subrecipients in several ways, including advance payments and on a reimbursement basis, is indicated in the final rule. And there also is language that states, given the broad flexibility that recipients have in selecting eligible uses and the broad variety of potential subrecipients, Treasury believes that specifying a single method of advancement or reimbursement would add unnecessary administrative difficulty to program administration. Recipients may determine the optimal payment structure for the transfer of funds, for example, advance funds, reimbursement basis from recipients to subrecipients. The money committees may wish to consider establishing a budget policy relating to the timing of transfer of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds to state agencies and organizations which have been approved in allocation of funds to ensure that the approved programs can be implemented in a timely manner and that the funds are expended by the December 31st, 2026 federal deadline. Those considerations could indicate that 100% of the approved funding is advanced up front, or that some portion of the approved allocation is advanced up front, such as 75% or 50%. So the bottom of page 9 is the consideration for the committees, and that is whether to establish a budget policy regarding the timing of transfers of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds to state agency budgets or organizations that is different than the current reimbursement process. That would be done through memorializing the intent of the money committees that approved authorizations of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds be transferred to and made immediately available for state agencies and organizations for which programs have been approved. Establish whether the policy would require the transfer of 100% of the authorized amount or some portion of the authorized amount, such as 50% or 75% of the total authorized amount. Or alternatively, take no action, thus allowing the Governor's Finance Office to continue operating under the current existing reimbursement policy or under another policy to be determined in the future by the Governor's Finance Office. Madam Chair, that brings us to the fourth item for consideration. And this is to provide information on unobligated funding and projected savings from approved program allocations and determining priorities for consideration of possible reallocations of those savings to address legislative priorities. With the December 31st, 2024 deadline to obligate funds, the full legislature will not have another opportunity after the conclusion of the 2023 legislative session to prioritize the use of any identified savings or unobligated coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. I was definitive in that statement. I probably should have said may not, but I won't go down the road of saying why it should be may. I don't want to suggest anything. That would be special if you understand what I'm saying. There's a table on page 9 to demonstrate what the current unobligated balance of funds is as calculated by fiscal staff. So if you look at the table in moving left to right, the first column identifies the total amount of funding received by the state. You take that less the actual fiscal year 2022 expenditures. Take that less the $2.263 billion that we've referenced several times today in the current authority, less the new authorizations that are included in the governor's recommended budget of $31.45 million. That would be inclusive of the enhancement decision units, inclusive of the $26 million that I mentioned earlier to continue programs approved during the interim, less approximately $2 million that has been set aside to support the governor's recommended COLA for positions that are funded with coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds, less approximately $416,000 in new funding that's identified by the governor's finance office for a future biennium commitment. That leaves just over $1 million in unobligated funds. In other words, through the governor's recommended budget and action taken during the interim as well as action taken during the 2021 legislative session, almost 100% of the state's allocated funds have been obligated. What is not accounted for on this table is any potential savings that may and is likely to occur as programs wrap up in fiscal year 23 or as agencies or organizations finalize what the actual expenditure plan may look like. There's a number of computer system modernizations. There's some construction that's funded. All of those approvals were based on projections, and once the actual numbers come in, there's likely to be savings. At this point in time, I'd like to just cover some of the savings that have been identified, and we need and will continue to work on identifying savings and potential savings that may be available for consideration by this body. There is a work program submitted for IFC. IFC is going to meet on Thursday. That work program identifies $7.5 million in savings from programs that have been finalized. The committee members may recall last interim at the April 7th, 2022 meeting of the IFC, authorization of $100 million was approved and set aside for allocations to state agencies. Currently, $67.9 million of the $100 million has been allocated. There's approximately $32.1 million in unobligated authority under this program. The governor's finance office has indicated that they have certain program areas earmarked or flagged for use of a portion of that $32 million. I believe that that may include shoring up some budgets that have revenue shortfalls still from administrative assessment revenues that are not coming in as projected. So, but the money committees could consider re-obligating any savings under that $100 million authority. And if there's an appetite or desire to do that, your fiscal staff would need to work with the governor's finance office to understand what has been set aside but not yet requested through the IFC for use of that remaining $32.1 million. And there would need to be some sort of agreement that whatever is identified as savings to repurpose, that is not going to be obligated for some other purpose by the end of the fiscal year. Meaning that there has to be some sort of consensus on what that actual savings is and is available for potential repurposing. While most work programs require IFC approval, not all work programs require IFC approval. If there's a work program, for example, to use funds for the judicial branch is exempt from the portion of the State Budget Act that requires IFC to approve its work programs. So when I say that some sort of consensus would need to be come to between fiscal staff and the governor's finance office, those are the types of things that I'm talking about to ensure that nothing else would get approved that would not otherwise require approval of the IFC or be identified in advance. Going on to page 11, you may recall during the March 20th budget hearing, the governor's finance office had testified that they were working on an analysis of the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds and had a deadline of March 24th to provide information to the governor's office. The governor's finance office did provide a detailed workbook to fiscal staff with information about program allocations, pending obligations, project timelines, status updates, as well as projected savings, which would be available for repurposing. Within that information, $5 million in savings was identified at this time. However, fiscal staff has not had time to fully analyze that information and work with the governor's finance office. There appears to be some discrepancies between that $5 million and the work program that I mentioned that's coming to the IFC on Thursday. And so whether that $5 million is in addition to the $7.5 million that's coming to IFC or is a subset of that is something that we need to work through. In addition, the governor's finance office provided information that an additional $5.6 million in savings that's not reflected in the workbook has been identified. So that is additional savings that is available and could be repurposed by this body for another purpose or to meet a priority of the legislature. The governor's finance office is going to continue to solicit and receive information from state agencies on how the spending and plans for all approved programs occurs. They will get reports on a monthly basis, analyze those reports, and will make those reports available to fiscal staff. The next updated report is anticipated to be available on or by Friday, April 21st of this year. In addition to identifying savings, the 2023 legislature could consider identifying programs for which approved authorizations of funding could be reduced or canceled. In other words, deobligate funds from those programs and use the deobligated funds for another purpose. There is a table at the bottom of page 11 to demonstrate that while at this time there's, I guess we'll call it somewhere between $12 and $15 million of identified savings, there's likely to be additional savings realized with the close of fiscal year 23 and into the upcoming biennium. The items in the table on page 11 just demonstrate program approvals and authorizations, what's been expended to date as of March 29th, and the remaining authority for those programs. So for example, there is about $50 million approved for the restoration of positions in fiscal year 23 that would otherwise have been held vacant or eliminated. Of that $50 million, $19.3 million has been expended as of March 29th. leaves about $30.8 million in authority. While we won't know what the final savings are until the fiscal year is closed, and that will not occur until September timeframe, it's likely that there's going to be some savings from those position restorations, that the entire $50 million will not be expended. So the table here just provides examples for some program areas that there probably is likely or could be additional savings that is realized. I would note, just because I looked this morning, the last item on your table has to do with the furlough repayments that were approved at the December IFC meeting. There was a transaction or transactions posted yesterday in the state's accounting system. So of the $35.466 million, based on the additional amount posted in the accounting system yesterday, about $34 million has been spent to reimburse employees for furloughs. So the remaining authority is closer to about $1.4 million at this point in time. So on page 12, again, just to reiterate, if there are savings realized in fiscal year 2023, a number of those savings will not be known until the fiscal year is closed out, which is likely not to occur until September of 2023, well after the 23 legislative session has ended. And again, with the December 31st, 2024 federal deadline to obligate these funds, the full legislature may not have another opportunity after the conclusion of the 23 legislative session to prioritize the use of identified savings or unobligated coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. So there's 4 bullet points on page 12 that the committees may wish to consider, and that's directing fiscal staff to continue to work with the governor's finance office to identify available remaining authority under the $100 million state agency allocation. Consider developing a priority order of spending of any available savings that's identified or that may become available. To direct fiscal staff to work with the governor's finance office and or directly with state agencies to identify estimated savings from program allocations so that any such savings can be redirected to meet legislative priorities for the 2023 to 25 biennium. And direct fiscal staff to bring any identified savings to the closing of the COVID-19 relief programs budget, which is tentatively scheduled for the end of April. So the decision box there on page 12 is to prioritize and allocate any available remaining authority under the $100 million state agency allocation, and or to specify a priority order of spending for available savings or unobligated coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds which are identified or that may become available. Madam Chair, that covers the 4 items that are included in the work session document. I'll go over, I'd say briefly, but I don't think I've been brief up to this point, so why start? No. I'm sorry.
Mr. Leiser, the floor is all yours.
There's the final item in your work session document is something that we talked about with the first 2 items, and that's whether to grant fiscal staff blanket authority to make technical adjustments relating to the budgeting of approved program allocations funded with coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. So as discussed under items 1 and 2, the committees could grant blanket authority for fiscal staff to make technical adjustments across all budgets in which coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds have been authorized and in which there are projected expenditures over the 23-25 biennium and 25-27 biennium that are not currently accounted for in the executive budget in order to reconcile the budgeting of all coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds. Again, fiscal staff would provide a summary of the adjustments and a global representation of all coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds budgeted over the 23-25 biennium in a format similar to the attachment A. Again, this would allow for the legislatively approved budget to memorialize the priorities of the legislature and to provide a more accurate representation of the budgeting of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds over the 2023 to 25 biennium. So the action, and this would be an action item, Madam Chair, if you wished to entertain it, where the committee would take a vote on, and that would be whether the committees wish to provide fiscal staff with authority to make technical adjustments within individual agency budget accounts, as well as within the COVID-19 relief programs budget for the purpose of aligning projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds over the 2023 to 25 biennium. In addition, would the committees wish to provide fiscal staff the authority to make technical adjustments to account for the obligation of funds for projected expenditures in the 2025 to 27 biennium for approved program allocations with the intent to ensure the legislatively approved budget provides the most accurate and up-to-date information memorializing approved obligations and budgeting of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leiser. And committee, I believe what we will do is go back and have conversation about the information that we have heard, and then we will move forward on some of this. So if you have questions on the first item, please go ahead, Assemblywoman Kusama.
Thank you very much for this very detailed, informative presentation. Just for my understanding, when I look at pages 4 and 5, and we have a decision unit of 1 or 2, 100% or not authorize any adjustments. So if I look at the example on page 4, which you discussed, the $151 million for the construction of new facilities for the public health system. If we were to choose number 2, would that mean that that $151,000, because it's not authorizing adjustments, would essentially be lost? We would need decision unit number 1 to be able to reallocate that $151 million, because we won't be able to expend that by the deadline.
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Kusama. If option 2 were chosen, the $151 million authority would not be lost or would not be taken away or deobligated for the original purpose that it was approved for. What option 2 would do would be that there would be no funding included in the legislatively approved budget or reflected in the legislatively approved budget for the $151 million for the construction of the new facilities and renovations. However, because that program was approved through the IFC and through the work program process, the authority currently exists in the budget in fiscal year 2023. So in the State Budget Act, NRS 353.220, Section 8B, allows state agencies to balance forward any unexpended funds from one fiscal year to the next fiscal year, as long as the balance forward purpose is for the same purpose as originally authorized. So taking this example, if option 2 were selected and none of the $151 million was expended in fiscal year 23, we would expect to see a work program processed and approved by the Governor's Finance Office to balance forward the $151 million in authority from fiscal year 23 to fiscal year 24. That balanced forward work program would not come before the interim finance committee because of the statute that allows it to be approved without going to IFC. So the authority would still be there, and the authority would still be available to balance forward to fiscal year '24. It just would not be reflected in the legislatively approved budget, and the action to balance forward the authority would not come before the interim finance committee.
But it would still have to be used for the original intended purpose.
That is correct.
So to use $151 million on a construction project in 2 years is still not going to happen. So we would risk losing that, correct?
The agency would have the authority to balance forward any unexpended funds from that project until the project is complete or until the point in time which we've passed the federal deadline. So they would say, again, just trying to walk through the example, if $151 million was balanced forward from fiscal year '23 to '24, and then only $21 million was expended in fiscal year '24, the agency would be allowed to balance forward $130 million from fiscal year '24 to '25 under the provisions of NRS 353.220, and continue to do that until the project is complete or we've reached the federal deadline in which the funds, any remaining funds would have to be reverted to the federal government.
So under number one, we could reallocate the $151 million to other areas.
I think separate from this particular decision point, this body could look at and make decisions to deobligate funds from programs that have been approved, either programs that were approved last session or programs that were approved during the interim. We would want to give consideration or probably have conversations about any such considerations to deobligate funds. For this particular program, for instance, I don't know if there have been any contracts entered into to begin the construction work, whether there's a contractual obligation of the state to move forward with these types of funds. Those types of things would need to be considered if the body wanted to deobligate funds for any of the programs that have been approved to this point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any additional discussion? Senator Gansert, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So kind of going over, there's sort of, in my mind, there's two issues, obligating it and then also spending it. So obligation has to be by December 31st of 2024, and then dollars have to be spent by the end of '26, right? And so it's, from what you just went over, it sounded like the process of our putting these in the budget affirms to the federal government that the funds have been obligated, because they actually, we've earmarked them to be obligated, but they may not be completely obligated because of the process that we've gone through. So I guess that's the first question. Is that correct?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Severs-Gansert, that is correct. Accounting for them would memorialize and demonstrate an obligation of the funds.
Thank you. And then when you talked about deobligate, the process that we had for obligation is all the recommendations came out of the governor's office, and then they would flow through to IFC, and then we would approve or not approve them. But the original intent of how dollars should be spent came from the governor's office. So looking at if we do obligated funds, would that be the same process because of the way the money was passed from the federal government? So if you deobligate something, it goes back to the governor's office to make a recommendation on how to obligate those funds again.
Thank you. For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Severs-Gansert. Depending on the timing, I would say I'd have to answer your question looking at it two ways. If the legislative body, if the money committees chose to deobligate funds from a program or to use savings for a program, a priority of this body, that could be done through the budget process this session. And the money committees could indicate and identify the program areas that they would like to prioritize and allocate funds to. And that would be done through the budget process and then captured through the, if included within the individual budget accounts as part of the budget closing process, would be rolled up and accounted for in the Authorizations Act. Alternatively, other pieces of legislation, separate legislation, could be used to obligate or allocate funds for a specific priority of the legislature. So the legislature and the money committees have that opportunity to repurpose and obligate funds through the budget process and through the passage of legislation during the legislative session. Following sine die, any remaining unobligated funds or any additional savings that would be identified after the legislature has concluded, after the session has concluded sine die, any new recommendations to prioritize those savings, additional savings, would come forward through the governor's office. And if they met the statutory requirements to come to IFC approval, would come to IFC. But they would come at the recommendation of the governor. So Senator Sievers-Ganser, I hope I answered your question in that the legislature could and does have the authority to set the priorities for how the funds would be spent. If there is not designation for how the legislative body wants any funds, any unobligated or savings, potential savings to be spent, then the recommendation for use of those savings following the conclusion of the legislature would come through the governor's office.
Thank you for that answer, and if I can just follow up. Our process so far has always been governor to the legislative body, and I was thinking about the timing of the funds. So when we were in session last time in 21, the governor was making proposals on how to spend the money through his executive budget, and the legislature was using that process to review and approve or to change it. Is that why there's this authority now, or I need to understand what happened in 21 versus what you've presented now, because everything I remember, it came through the governor's office as far as the recommendations.
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Sievers-Ganser. There was timing, I don't want to call them issues, but timing considerations last legislative session. And while the state knew that the coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds were coming, the funds did not get deposited into the state's bank account until around June 4th, I believe. And so there was a number of discussions last legislative session about how to prioritize the use of the funds, but without actual receipt of the funds, it was a unique situation and scenario. And I know that there were discussions going on with among the governor's office and among the legislative body for how to use those funds. There were a couple, I think 3 pieces of legislation. I'm trying to look at my sheet here, 3 or 4, a handful number of bills that were passed last legislative session to authorize and obligate a portion of these funds. And that included Senate Bill 459, Assembly Bill 484, Assembly Bill 486, Assembly Bill 495, Senate Bill 461. Some of those those bills specified a very specific use of the funds, and my recollection is that a number of those were priorities of the legislative body. While it may have been a shared priority with the governor's office, the legislature did have a say and did pass legislation to establish priorities for expenditure of the funds through those pieces of legislation. Now, those bills only obligated, a handful, and I'm probably should have the spreadsheet up on my computer, but it looks like probably somewhere around maybe around $650 million. Following sine die of the 2021 session, then the process through the interim was really driven by the governor's office. The governor's office made recommendations for how to allocate those funds, and those recommendations were brought before the interim finance committee through the work program vehicle to approve during the interim. So the difference this legislative session is we know that we've got the fund. The state knows that we've got the funds. The challenge is almost all but, as I mentioned, all but $1 million of the $2.7 billion is obligated. And so if this legislative body would like to prioritize the use of these funds for something other than what's already been approved or what's already recommended in the governor's budget, this body can do that through the budget process and identify what those priorities should be.
Thank you.
Additional questions, comments? Senator Canizaro?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a question. I want to thank you, Mr. Leiser, for a very complete and thorough walkthrough of all of this. And it's very much appreciated because I know it's a lot to keep track of and to be able to walk all of us through. I think just in terms of my comment, Madam Chair, I would be comfortable with allowing and directing fiscal staff to work with the governor's finance office and state agencies so we can do adjustments to account for those items that we've already allocated through the process with IFC and with the decision to do that through the budget process. So we would account for 100% of those projected expenditures for these COVID relief dollars. For those approved allocations, because we have had a lot of those discussions. We did go through this. I know we've talked about this the last few meetings, that there was considerable time and effort put into vetting certain things so that those dollars could go to those projects. And I think that should be reflected in the budget. Additionally, I think there was a request to give blanket authority to make those technical adjustments by staff across all budgets for expenditures in the 2023-25 biennium, so we can reconcile that. And then also to make, to give the committees that summary and reconciliation of all approved authorizations and make any adjustments to account for those expenditures.
Okay, thank you. So just to recount what you are suggesting, we would direct staff to account for 100% of the projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds for approved program allocations over the 23-25 biennium.
Yes, Madam Chair, I think that would be the direction that I would be comfortable with, and then I know there were some accompanying pieces of that for technical adjustments and some follow-up documentation from staff,
Yes.
so we can account for that.
Thank you very much. Senator Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that comment and statement. I just need, for my clarification, are we using allocated and obligated synonymously?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Titus, in my testimony, yes, I believe I've used those interchangeably.
All right, thank you, because there is some difference, but I just want to make clear that when you say allocated, that would be a substantial obligation.
Madam Chair, again, for the record, Brody Leiser, through you to Senator Titus. In my testimony, talking about what's been obligated, I've been and/or allocated, I've been using those terms to describe programs in which there has been approval either by the 2021 legislative body or through the interim to approve an allocation of funds for certain programs, which also demonstrates an obligation of funds.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then any questions on number 2, starting at the bottom of page 5, going 6 to the top of page 7? Seeing no questions, then I would suggest that we direct staff to account for 100% of projected 25-27 biennium expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds within the legislatively approved budget for the 23-25 biennium. Moving on, questions on number 3, which is page 7 and 8 through page 9. Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Leiser, for the presentation. I just wanted to confirm when we talked about number 3, you were, I believe, talking about in fiscal year 2022 how much, try to say this right, how much of the funds have been spent versus allocated. And I understand we had to repay a loan from the federal government for unemployment. So I'm going to back that out of the calculation because I think that's a pretty easy thing to do, to repay at least procedurally easy, to pay a $332 million loan. But am I correct that as of this point, the state has only spent somewhere around 4% of the remaining Corona state fiscal recovery funds?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Speaker Yeager. I would characterize the 4% as an accurate representation of what was spent in fiscal year 22 if you back out the repayment for the unemployment compensation fund. That in fiscal year 22, accounting for that $332 million payment, there was about $108 million expended, which is about 4% of the state's total allocation. If you also accounted for fiscal year 23 expenditures to date, which is around $112 million, those two combined would be about 8 or 9% of the state's total allocation.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, could I just make a comment on that?
Absolutely.
I will say I am concerned. 8% is not much. Obviously, we've had a discussion about funds being allocated or obligated, but I just wonder if the process that we have in place is working. I'm very concerned about having to potentially return some of this funding to the federal government. And, I think through the IFC process and through the 21 legislature, we made some really strategic decisions about where to obligate this money. I think through this process, this budgeting process, we've heard some discouraging testimony about positions not being filled, positions not being created, and I'm certainly not here to blame anybody. We've had quite a bit of turnover in executive agencies, as is to be expected with a new administration. But I just want to say that anything I think we can do as a body to ensure that we are spending every single dollar and not in a position where we're going to have to return any of this money is something that we should be focusing on. So, Madam Chair, I guess I'll leave it there, but I just wonder if this process we have is really working, because 8% is not very much.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman. Any additional comments? Then with this, I believe that I think that we would direct staff to memorialize the intent of the money committees that approved authorizations of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds be transferred to and made immediately available for state agencies and organizations for which programs have been approved. And please establish whether the policy would require the transfer of 100% of the authorized amount or some portion of the authorization, such as 50% or 75% of the total authorized amount. Is there any discussion on whether the 100%, 50%, 75%? Senator Cannizzaro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we've talked a lot about this in a couple of hearings with respect to the reimbursement process and what that looks like. And so in response to your question about whether that would be maybe a portion thereof, one of the things that that Mr. Leiser mentioned that I think is important to keep in mind is that there was a very small percentage, I think 3 requests, that were found to potentially not be compliant, some of which has been returned of, if I remember correctly, like 18,000 and change, and then some others that were still under review. But most of the programs that these monies were allocated to and which were vetted for before they were approved for those funds were using those funds in an appropriate fashion. So for me, that's a lot of comfort in that because there was some upfront vetting for these recipients in the first instance, and because they are certainly very compliant with what and how those funds are being used for the purposes which were identified before they were granted those dollars, and that this does not seem to be an issue of reimbursements not taking place because of inappropriate use of those funds or those organizations not being forthcoming about how they're using those funds. That for me, I think if we were to approve a different process, I would suggest 50% of an allocation in an upfront advance, and then once there's been an opportunity to kind of view how those funds have been utilized, assuming that there aren't some issues identified, then the remaining 50% could be advanced so that they can use those funds and we can actually get these dollars out and spent. Because I would agree with the speaker's comments that there's some concerns about whether this money is going to be spent, and there has been a lot of work done on the front end before even allocating these dollars. And so anything we can do to help that process, I think, would be a good direction to go. And so I would suggest just doing the 50% advance on the front end for those programs and those recipients. And then once we've gotten some documentation showing how they're utilizing those monies, to approve another 50% advance.
Thank you very much. Senator Ganser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the majority leader's comments, and I agree. I also think we need to have some sort of reporting mechanism, so we're going to let it out, and I'm not sure when we're going to check on it again, but maybe IFC meetings to see how that process is working, because I think we're all concerned about making sure all the money gets spent, and the current process, I think, is been very bureaucratic, and it's proved that we really haven't had much that would have been denied. So I agree with that too. But I also think that we need to set some sort of interim, or maybe IFC, we have a check to make sure it's getting spent down, because if we change the process and they're not spending it down, we're going to have to take other measures to make sure that the dollars are spent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it is my understanding that every IFC, we receive a report. So that piece is already sort of embedded in our process. So with that, I would suggest that we, as previously stated, that it would be 50% of the total authorized amount. And with that, we can move on to the next item, number 4, which begins on page 10 of your paperwork and moves to page 12. Is there any discussion? And if not, I would believe that we would like to direct staff to prioritize and allocate any available remaining authority under the 100 million state agency allocation. And specify a priority order of spending for any available savings or unobligated coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds which are identified or that may become available. And with that, we can move on to the next item, which would be 12 and 13. And this particular item requires us to take a vote. So Mr. Leiser, would you repeat that item for me? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Brody Leiser. So the last item in the vote here would be to grant the blanket authority for staff to make technical adjustments as described in accounting for the budgeted revenues and expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds over the upcoming biennium, and to account for those that are projected in the 2025-27 biennium, so that those are memorialized and demonstrated in the legislatively approved budget. And so the question for the committees on page 13 is, do the committees wish to provide fiscal staff with authority to make technical adjustments within individual agency budget accounts as well as within the COVID-19 relief programs budget for the purpose of aligning projected expenditures of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds over the 2023-25 biennium? And in addition, do the committees wish to provide fiscal staff with the authority to make technical adjustments to account for the obligation of funds for projected expenditures in the 2025-27 biennium for approved program allocations with the intent to ensure the legislatively approved budget provides the most accurate and up-to-date information, memorializing approved obligations and budgeting of coronavirus state fiscal recovery funds?
Thank you very much. And do I have a motion? Thank you very much, Assemblyman Yeager. Second from Assemblywoman Bacchus. And is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Thank you very much. Motion passes. And with that, I believe, Mr. Leiser, you may finish your coffee. Thank you very much. And we will now move on to public comment, which is the last item on our agenda today. Due to time considerations, please remember 2-minute limit. To call in to provide testimony, please dial 888-475-4499. When prompted, the meeting ID will be 821-2131-8144, and then press pound. When prompted for the participant ID, press pound. And I'll begin public comment here in Carson City. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, good morning. Kyle Dalpy with Western Nevada College. A quick note just to tell you that today is WNC Day at the Legislature, and because there is no floor session on the Assembly side, it is now more of a challenge to get every one of you with the mascot, so we've got him positioned in the hallways. We would appreciate taking a picture with Willie the Wildcat, stopping by our booth if you can. Behind me I have several students from our student government, one elected regent, one faculty member, one faculty member spouse, when we all came in to hear Mr. Leisner's great presentation, and please join us today as we celebrate higher ed, and thank you for all you do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As a former Las Vegas High School Wildcat, I'll be happy to do that. Seeing no more comment here in Carson City, we'll go to Las Vegas. Seeing no one in Las Vegas, BPS, we'll go to the lines.
you would like to make public comment, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Public line is open and working. There are no callers at this time.
Thank you very much. And with that, committee members, this completes our business for today. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and this meeting is adjourned.